While for BIPOC folks, the challenge is internalized racism, right? I want to be clear about that. For white folks, the challenge really is internalized white supremacy. And so for white Christians and theologians, the violence is evident in their inability to address the sin of racism in a sustained way. So again, it's kind of internalized white supremacy. And so Cohn asks the question, why have white theologians, broadly speaking, and white Christians ignored racism, right? Why have they ignored talking about racism in a kind of theological perspective? For those of you who have been to seminary, I invite you to think about your training, right? Was the work of Cohn, Gutierrez, Dolores Williams, Maria Asasi Diaz, Katie Cannon, or George Tinker discussed in your systematic theology class? Or were they relegated to some additional work that you had to do if you wanted to learn those topics? They're the questions of theology, they're the questions of theologically justified colonialism, indigenous genocide, and enslavement get discussed with the same level of importance that was given to the problem of evil or the problem of God, or even the Reformation or the Great Schism in the church. So this is not to say that these past historical events are not important, but it is to say that theological education has decided that racism, colonialism, and white supremacy are not important enough to engage in a sustained way. Now, Cohn identifies 4 reasons why white theologians tend to not talk about racism. Essentially, he says they don't talk about racism because they don't have to talk about it, because that's a part of being white privilege. White theologians avoid racial dialogue because to talk about white supremacy arouses deep feelings of guilt, and you guys are going to talk more deeply about that in terms of white fragility. Whites avoid race topics because they don't want to engage Black rage, which again goes into this concept of white fragility. And lastly, whites do not say much about racial justice because they are not prepared for the radical redistribution of wealth and power. This one I find particularly interesting in light of the history of the church. So as a United Methodist clergy person, there is a long history of not only racism and segregation, but upon a kind of idea of what reconciliation might looks like, the challenge has always been, how do you go about reallocating resources and power? To be sure, the current problems we are dealing with right now with respect to sexuality stem from this logic of colonialism and are rooted very much in the issues of power and the unwillingness to be prepared for the redistribution of wealth. And what it means for certain groups of people to have power over money that other groups of people don't like, right? So these are very much still in tune with what's happening.